Hey everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode. In continuation from last week, I have no idea what number we are, but this week we were joined by some great guests in Emma Cowley and Emma Ross to discuss their recent publication in their research paper titled Invisible Sportswomen, the Sex Data Gap in Sport and Exercise Science Research. This was a fascinating conversation where they've taken an in-depth review of research that's been carried out between the years 2014 and 2020 and in the area of sport and exercise science, and have taken a look at the quantity and quality and inclusion criteria there around female athletes in that area. I thought we covered a lot of very interesting topics, and there were some real stark kind of takeaways from this, or points of note. What did you? How do you think about it, Murph?
I think it was just great to have a first repeat guest in Emma Cowley. I think we'll have to make her up a little award, or maybe give one of the snapbacks for that. I'm not going to pick out any highlights because, to be honest, I think the whole conversation is worth listening to. It would be unfair to pick out any one point over any other, so I'd encourage everyone to just listen in to the whole thing.
Brilliant. Well, here we go, and enjoy.
Anyway, big days for us here. First returning guest in Emma Cowley. Emma, great to have you back on.
Thanks so much for having me.
And joined today by Emma Ross, who is a co-author on a paper. Actually, is this out yet? And we'll go at point of recording here.
So it was due to be out this week in pre-print, but I haven't got the email yet. But it will be if it's in the October edition.
Oh, fair enough. By the time this goes out, you'll be able to find it somewhere, all like that. Anyway, joined by Emma Ross. You're based at the English Institute of Sport, amongst a few other places. I'll let you give a bit of an introduction to yourself there before I butcher it.
Yeah, no, I was based at the English Institute of Sport for 9 years, and recently just left to set up my own business called the Well HQ. So, and which we'll be talking about because it's related to some of the topics we're going to cover today.
And those topics we're talking about today, it's a new paper you've authored, as we just discussed, called Invisible Sportswomen. It's looking at the sex data gap in sport and exercise science research. It's something we would have touched on previously in other episodes with Orla Curran, Kelly McNulty. You mentioned it yourself, Emma, when you were on before. Just that in research in general, so much of it, particularly in sports science and exercise science, has been largely focused on males with, whether it be conscious or unconscious, we're not sure, we'll touch on in a while, a bit of a, I don't know if it's discrimination to the world, but an underrepresentation of females in that sports science research. Emma Cowley, we'll start off with yourself, and you can touch on your own previous research and stuff, everything here, if that guided. But how did this come to be? There's 4 of you as co-authors, fairly reasonably well spread around the world. How did you end up meeting or making contact or anything like that?
Oh God, well, I suppose is how the idea came to be was I want to say almost 2 years ago. My own PhD research looks at physical activity in teenage girls, and I think just being involved in sports science as a PhD student within the sports science department, within the literature, it's quite evident that there is a bit of a gender disparity, and so I was interested in looking to see, is there data available actually on that ratio of male to females within sport and exercise science. And there was a paper, but it was back from 2013, and I thought it would be really interesting to do kind of an updated review on that. So I kind of started working away through the data, and we have over 12 million participants in this. So this is why it started 2 years ago. It's quite a large undertaking of work, and I knew I wanted to collaborate with other female academics, and so Kelly, period of the period, is obviously pretty infamous in her field, and I think her research is really interesting, specifically looking at kind of methodology and that type of research. And then Alyssa, who wasn't able to join us today, is from the States, so she again looks very physiology based at specifically looking at physiology within women. And then Emma Ross is, I don't know if you need any introduction, Emma Ross, but I was at a wonderful webinar with Emma, I don't know how long ago it is now, a while, and I just thought, I'm just going to slide into her DMs there. I'm going to send her an email and tell her what I'm doing and see if she would be interested, because it would be fantastic to have her perspective on not only obviously the actual research, but how the lack of data like transpires and translates into practice. And then they were all kindly open to collaborating, and that's how the four of us came to be on the paper.
And I'd been at the time Em contacted me, I've been travelling around the country. So I was at the English Institute of Sport at the time, and I had been on a roadshow of education of coaches and athletes and sports science practitioners, and I'd been banding around this piece of data that was collected in 2015, which was that 4% of research is done exclusively on females. And I'd always thought, it's getting a bit out of date now. And I thought, oh my gosh, it would be so much hard work to do that survey again. And then Em contacted me and said, I've just spent a little bit of time collecting information across like millions of participants, across hundreds of studies. And I was like, wow, you're already, almost there in terms of being able to know what data what stat we can use now. I won't spoil the punchline by saying what that number is, but it was amazing to find someone who'd already been diligent enough to start that study and give us the information that we needed to be able to have an up-to-date statistic that we could use in terms of the gender data gap.
And in terms of like digging into it all then and looking at the research, could you give us just a couple of the highlights, or we could even call them lowlights, of what you actually found?
Yeah, so the original study by Costello et al. Had 3 journals, and I believe it was 3 years worth of data, 2 or 3 years. So our paper kind of took it from there. So it finished in 2013, the Costello paper. So ours looked between 2014 to 2020, and we expanded the search to 6 of the what we perceive to be top sport and exercise science journals. So not necessarily just by impact factor, but just by popularity as well. So as I said, we had over 12.5 million participants included, and over 5,000 original manuscripts were included. So things like animal studies and so on were excluded. And so we ran a chi-squared analysis. So we were literally just looking at the breakdown of male and female, and we also included data on if they included the specific population in the title, and then we also included the topic that they were researching. So, for example, were they looking at the menstrual cycle, or were they looking at a sex-specific topic? And then, do you want me to go into the results? Do you want me to?
Yeah.
So of all the papers, so of the 5,000 papers, 31% exclusively looked at men, and 6% looked at women exclusively. So not great. When you look at the absolute number of participants, we had a 66% male to 34% female, which seems a little bit better, a little bit better. But I think it's really when you're looking at when you're looking at papers that have excluded a particular sex, that 31 to 6% is pretty shocking. And then in terms of the titles, this is another thing that I'm particularly interested in. So of the studies, so they've actually said we are excluding women and whether they gave a justification or not. So of these studies that only included men, only 14% actually say that in the title. So if you're a coach, or if you're somebody who's just scanning through the title or the abstract, they don't make reference to the fact that those results only potentially apply to males until you get into the methods section, which is obviously pretty problematic, or potentially problematic. Whereas for female publications, so if you only include women, girls, female, one of those kind of terms are listed in 63% of female exclusive research, and that's a problem.
That can have quite a few negative knock-on implications, but even if you look at it from an academic or a teaching point of view and kind of take some of the more human or various issues like that out of it. When it comes to writing textbooks and everything, and this says this is how 12 people respond to, and we'll say for example, this dose of caffeine going to this bout of exercise, and if all 12 of those were male, it may be completely differently in females. But if follow-on textbooks are then written based on that, and coaches, teachers, researchers, whatever, see that and say, okay, grand, I'll just give this to blanket population here. It may be 6 males, it may be 6 females in the future, it may be 6 or 12 females in the future, and there are completely different responses, and everyone is wondering, well, why is this when it says humans respond this way? There's some of the big implications there. But there would also be other more, like I said, human or sociological impacts of this as well. Do you want to touch maybe on some of those before we go into a bit more detail on the physiological stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the biggest issue with this is that males are seen as the default. And I think that's where, like, for me, it's not, I think it's just about raising the awareness of our implicit biases. And, you know, this isn't just about males, it's just about the default of including human participants should be male and female. And if you're excluding one of them, there should be a solid physiological rationale or justification as to why something was included. And I also don't think that, you know, I think that a lot of studies that are done exclusively in males, those results may be perfectly translated to females, but we don't know. And I think, is that not the essence of science, of why we do investigations? We do investigations to, you know, look at these nuances. But including women shouldn't be a nuance or shouldn't be a special population. We make up 51% of the population. And so for me, yeah, I think it's just about changing the assumption that males are the default. And when we say humans, we should say in the title male and be specific.
You said you looked when you were going through them all methods and various things like that about justifications for not including females. Were there many of those provided, and what were some of the justifications around that?
So unfortunately we didn't look at this, and I, you know, in hindsight I wish we did, but I don't have data on if each manuscript that we included gave a rationale. So I don't know, Emma, Ross, have you come across anything on like justifications why people exclude women? Apart from that, it's just more difficult potentially.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It's a really interesting part of it's not interesting, which is why it's interesting part of the paper to read at the end, isn't it? When it's, you know, limitations to our paper, we didn't include women. And there's no justification, right? We didn't include women, so we don't know whether these findings extend to women. That's a limitation. Yes, it is. And I don't think people give very often the reasons. We know what the reasons are. We know that accounting for the changing physiology of the menstrual cycle, for example, in female participants, means that you have to either test females at a specific time of their cycle so you can really know what their physiology looks like. Now that screws up timing of your study, because you can't just say, well, we've got the lab on Wednesday the 3rd, everyone come in and do their baseline test, because your 30 women need to come in on 30 different days, because contrary to popular belief, we don't all sync our cycles if we hang around each other long enough. But also, if you really want to truly serve women with your research, you also need to understand, well, does caffeine, does cold water immersion, does whatever it is, skill acquisition, is it affected at different times of the cycle? Because we know that the physiology of women changes across their cycle. Oh, now I've got to get this woman in maybe twice, maybe 3 times to know what the influence of this intervention is at different times of the cycle. Oh, that's way too, time consuming, it's expensive, it takes resources. And so it just becomes prohibitive. And that's true, right? That's true. It does cost more. It does take more time. I think that's not a good enough excuse, but it is an excuse. And I think we do have to kind of build that into our thinking around funding and around almost including women a criteria of funding, so that you ask for enough so that you can do it. So other reasons are, we know that women don't come forward as much to be participants. There's a volunteer bias, and again, there are probably loads of sociological reasons why that is, but we're not getting enough women just coming forward and saying, yes, I'd like to participate in your research. We know that if you're trying to if you attract men and women and you say, well, great, we'll have a male group and we'll have a female group, it's really hard to match that female group against the male group. So you can't have matched controls, if you like. And so you end up stuffing them all in one group, and then they're really not homogenous as you would like your participant group to be. You know, you want them to be between 19 and 24 and be exercising for more than 5 hours a week, or, you know, you want them to fit your criteria, but suddenly you've put men and women together and they look a bit messy. So there's lots of reasons why it's hard to include females. None of them are good enough. None of them are good enough to exclude them.
I think another thing as well, like in terms of justifications, which you sometimes see in terms of, exclusion criteria, because the menstrual cycle might, or influences X, whatever I'm studying. But there's no citation, and it's just an assumption that the menstrual cycle does affect a lot of things, but it also doesn't affect a lot of things, but we don't know that because there's no, it's, you know what I mean? Like, it's just this perpetual cycle. And so I think having like a strong rationale that has been studied is really important. And then, if not including women, like if you're not including men on certain things, that's fine. I'm not saying, like, obviously the quality of the research, and like Emma's saying, that you need to reach sample size and it needs to be like feasible to carry out. And I don't think we should have research questions just to, token include women just for the sake of it. But yeah, I think it does require a bigger shift, and a lot of really basic research needs to be done on women to understand actually what these differences are. I think we just assume for so long such basic questions, or such basic like the effect of resistance training on women was only really, that sounds like such a simple question, but it was only really recently actually looked at specifically in women.
I'm just wondering, and either of you can kind of take this, but with, say, over the past maybe few years, participation levels in sport for females is like there's a big push to increase it, and levels in some sports have increased a bit. Would you see? Would participation levels then you'd be hoping in research also rise with that percentage rise, or do they kind of marry up in any way at all?
I mean, I think from my perspective, having worked in the applied, the place where you're trying to translate research into practice, the two are already too disconnected. I don't think often the science serves the direct needs of the end user, whether that's an athlete, a coach, a client, a patient, and that's probably a whole other conversation. But I think as participation of women increases, there is an increasing need to understand how to train women, how to support women. I think there will be a lag in terms of the quality research that supports that. And that's a big problem. And I think that's a call to researchers to look at what's happening in the real world and say, wow, there's a lot of women now playing rugby, playing football, playing sports where women weren't before, playing golf, and the participation base across all sports is increasing. So how do we, as a duty of care to those women who are doing those sports, how do we make sure they're being supported well enough, trained appropriately, cared for appropriately, treated and trained in a medical and a scientific way appropriately? And unless we have research to provide us with evidence, then we're not going to do a good job of that. And that's what we're kind of seeing now. So I think you're right in saying that it's really important to recognise that more women do sport, and more women do sport at a higher level as well as a participation. And we need the information to be able to support them well. But what I found when I was working at the English Institute of Sport is I made a real effort to go around and ask practitioners, strength and conditioning coaches, nutritionists, psychologists, coaches, do you treat your athlete as a female as well as an athlete? And most of them were like, I don't even understand the question, right? I'm really good at supporting or coaching athletes. I know how to make high performing athletes, and I know what it takes to get on the podium. Like, I don't need any more information than that. And lots of women in sport were like, please don't come in here and start saying that we're female, because we've tried for so long to get equity, whether it's in pay, whether it's in media coverage, whether it's in getting the access to coaching or facilities or equipment, the same pitches as the males. We don't want you drawing attention to that. And so we had this space where everyone was kind of ignoring the fact that these people were female. And I was going in going, but they are. And, if we step back and say, the physiology of a female is very different from the physiology of a man. And like Em just said, like how we adapt to strength training. Oh, that might be different. It might be different at different times of our cycle. It might be different because we have different hormonal environments in general. It might be different because, we those hormones affect muscle, affect brain, whatever. But no one had ever kind of stopped to go, oh yeah, that's probably worth considering in this applied setting. And so it was about telling people that they needed to look at this athlete as a female. And then they got scared because they're like, well, I don't know anything about that. Because it's not in my coach education, it's not in my practitioner education, it's not in my sports science degree, it's not in my medical degree. And I'm a really experienced coach and I'm very confident with what I'm delivering. I'm a really experienced PE teacher. I'm very experienced with what I'm delivering. And now you're coming in here and showing me this whole load of stuff that I don't understand. So it's really tricky, like this gender data gap is kind of the start of a much bigger picture. And so I think it's really brilliant that we've got some current data to put out with this paper. But then also I really hope that it starts bigger conversations, because I think, one is holding the mirror up to academia or research. And I was part of that, by the way. This is not pointing fingers at all. I was, for 10 years, I was an academic and a researcher doing experiments either very badly on women, because I didn't do what our co-author Kelly McNulty says we should do in her methodology papers, or I was excluding women because they were tricky. I've been there. I know why that happens. So we need to hold the mirror up to research and say we need to do that better. But we also need to put this number, this 6% of research is done on exclusively on women. We need to hold it up to governing bodies and funding bodies and people who need to know it, because the work I've been recently doing with, like Sport England, Sport Ireland, Sport Scotland, and saying, by the way, do you know that all the best practice is based on research predominantly done in men? And they say, oh, what? So our PTs are not training our females well, our coaches are not training our female athletes well. You go, yeah, because what they're doing is based on something that's not optimized for women. And so that gender data gap statistics, the information that we've collected in this paper, has such value across research and practice. Sorry, that was a long answer, John and Damien.
That was brilliant. And one of the things that struck me there, Emma, as you were going through that, was a conversation we actually had with Kelly previously on one or two other podcasts as well. The frequency of female athletes in many different sports who will go very long periods of time without their experiencing their menstrual cycle and almost wear it like a badge of honor. Like, I'm training this hard and completely missing the health implications that could come with. And right, you could look at the athlete and say, surely you should be, thinking about your health here with that. But if you do have coaches who don't understand that this is something that needs to be calculated in, this is something that needs to be thought about, well, it's you have a chain there where everyone is just kind of, blinkers on, let's keep going, and, potentially doing harm.
Yeah, and I think absolutely doing harm, and we see that happening, and this is actually, we have a lot of data on what used to be called the female athlete triad, what is now called relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S, losing your periods when you're doing lots of sport and you're not fueling properly. We actually now have quite a lot of data, albeit it's a really small pocket of data, because we know that most of the data is collected on men, but we know enough now to take action, but we're not used to translating research into practice with that kind of female-centric lens. And so now you've got loads of coaching qualifications which never even mention that, like your athlete should definitely not be losing her period, because you know what's now happening in her body and the implications that could have for her performance, her health, her long-term health. And there was a study done recently which showed that something like 3 out of the top 20 coaching certificates in Australia, I believe, across lots of different sports, pathway through to podium, coach development programs, only 3 of them out of 20 mention what you've just described, Damien, like low energy availability, menstrual cycle being disrupted, bone health being impacted. So you've got coaches at all levels not knowing this important information, and partly that's because the research isn't out there. But there is some research out there about this, but because we've got so ingrained in kind of treating women and men the same, we're not going back to the research and saying, by the way, is there anything about women or females that I really need to know as a coach? Because although we keep saying there's not enough data, not enough evidence, we do know some stuff, but it's being poorly translated into practice. And so, like a double whammy there, really.
Just on your points there that we do know some stuff, like without going into massive detail, what do we know? Like some areas that are specific to females, or in terms of physiological differences, what are we aware of currently? We know the menstrual cycle does have an impact. We know some ways how it does, but not fully. But other areas of female physiology, like, and we touched on the resistance training there, are there major differences? Are there slight differences between male and female responses? Or what other aspects are we now clear that, yes, there are differences there that we need to be mindful of?
I mean, I would say don't write off everything you know, but do look at it again. If you've done a sports science degree, I could probably, you could probably walk into each module and say, like, some of this applies to everyone, brilliant. The basic principle training, progression, overload, recovery. Like, there's no human who's not going to, within the normal distribution of humans, going to respond well to that type of well-designed training program. But if you're talking about optimizing and really tailoring your training approach to your physiology, we know, like you said, the menstrual cycle and the physiology that it creates can impact tons of stuff, like adaptation to resistance training, metabolism, recovery time, joint laxity, loads of stuff is going on across the cycle. We know that, for example, sports bras and breast support has a massive implication on performance as well as health. No one's getting that information into the hands of coaches and athletes. So a poorly supporting sports bra costs you a mile in a marathon. And because breast movement, basically, when your breasts are moving, your body is trying to compensate for that. It makes your running gait less economical. It uses more energy. Your stride length shortens, and it costs you a mile over a marathon. And you go, wow, we don't learn about bras. But if you said to someone, I'll give you a mile over a marathon, and they'll say, I'll take that. And what are you giving me? I'm giving you a really well-fitting sports bra. Well, not you personally, John, but not unless you tell me you need it. There's areas of like female physiology that are being overlooked. They're being well researched by small groups of people, but really overlooked in terms of getting that information out. We do a lot of work around pelvic floor health in women. So we think of urinary stress incontinence as a mum problem. We know that up to 40% of athletes leak urine when they do sport before they even have families and babies. So they've got dysfunction there, and we don't know how to train it. You ask an S&C coach how to train it. They don't. And if they do, they're usually not doing it properly. So the reason, again, that 6% is important, rather than saying, well, how many research participants were women? Oh, well, that was about 30%, so it's all right. 6% is done exclusively on women, which means 6% of research is done exclusively on things like breast support, pelvic health in women, menstrual cycle, because they only happen in the female body. And that's why we know enough to know that we need to know more, I guess, is the position we're in at the moment.
Your question that you asked is the English Institute of Sport around, you're treating her as an athlete, but you're also treating her as a female. If a coach or any member of support staff were to treat an athlete as a female, what would that look like?
Yeah, great question. Turn this into tangible stuff. So first of all would be, I think, improving your understanding, because a lot of this stuff is stuff we don't get taught. So understand what the menstrual cycle is. Like, do you know what what's happening across the cycle, and then in the most, we don't need to be experts here, but in the most, headline way, how that might affect training, how that might affect your athlete's ability to show up and deliver 100% in training. And then where you get to is, we should probably know about the menstrual cycle as a coach-athlete relationship, right? Yeah, you should. So maybe that's what you should be doing is, if you've got the type of relationship which supports this, incorporating that athlete's experience of the menstrual cycle into your coaching conversations. Like, a question I would ask a female athlete is, are you able to turn up and give 100% every day? And for a lot of women, they'll say, well, yeah, no, there's about 3 or 4 days where that is not going to happen. And you go, okay, well, do you need it to happen? Well, yeah, my program's kind of full on. Okay, so what are you doing about that? Oh, nothing, I'm just putting up with it. So for me, that's a coaching conversation. Okay, and the coach doesn't have to have the answer about how to get rid of period cramps or menstrual migraines, but they do need to know they're happening and then say, what are you doing about it? Like, what can we do? Where can we go to find information that might make that better? So I think there's that. There's certainly checking in on all aspects of female health. Like, it feels awkward to have a conversation about a sports bra, right? But all you need, you're an athlete you're a coach working with an athlete, and you say, did you know that sports bras are really important? And they go, well, not really. Oh, okay, well, let's listen to this podcast and let's find out something about it, and let's go onto that website and just check you've got the right fit, because that's the least of our worries. Like, we do not need that to be holding you back. Okay, check. Bra done. Pelvic floor, are we incorporating that into our program? No. Well, do we need to? It's just kind of a checklist for me about some of these things that, especially if you're used to coaching men, it won't even be part of the conversation. And it's about creating a space with that athlete where she can bring the female parts of herself and not be judged. I think if there was anything, and again, that's not tangible, that's not a checklist, but ultimately that's about trust, right? And that's knowing that you can show up and say, I've got period pain, or I do leak when I'm doing double unders and I don't like it makes me anxious, and not have your coach going, suck it up, get on with it. Your coach going, that doesn't seem right. Shall we explore it a bit more? Because you can guarantee if you go with fluid leaking out your ear instead of leaking into your pants, or if you go with a recurring shoulder injury instead of abdominal cramps that flare up every month, you're going to get a different conversation with your coach. That's, geez, how do we fix this? Because that's holding you back. Whereas if you go with this female type of conversation, somehow the bias is a little bit more judgmental, a little bit more, this is fragility, this is weakness, not just, this is part of who I am and let's sort it out so I can go and be the best version of myself.
Have you found female coaches to be a little bit more understanding or aware of various aspects that way, or is it almost across the board because we just don't have the research to support it all?
There's been a real mixed bag. So I wouldn't put male coaches into a bucket and say none of them knew what they were doing and everyone was resistant. I would put loads of them into the really eager to learn, well-intended, like, give me the information, I really want to do better. And some who didn't want to know, fine, we'll work on those. And then in the females, the same. So some females completely got it because, they might have experienced some of this stuff themselves. And so they would be really openly having conversation with girls about their periods or their menstrual cycles or their bras or whatever it was. There were other females who, let's say their lived experience of their body wasn't like that. Then they might be saying, well, I got period cramps, I always had to train through it when I was an athlete, so they can just get on with it. And it's this kind of the danger that you are projecting your own experience onto someone else, because your period cramps aren't going to be the same as her period cramps. It's just matter of fact. How do we even know? When you say I've got a headache, how do I know that it's the same or different from the headaches that I get? How can I say, carry on, John, you've got a headache, you can carry on because I can? You might say, well, my headaches are blinding. My headaches mean that I can't even string a sentence together. So projecting your own experience as a woman onto another woman you're training is also really dangerous. So we need to kind of take a step back and develop empathy rather than that judgment.
That's probably I suppose a risk that you do have from ex-athletes becoming coaches and just going, this worked for me, so therefore let's just apply it and not question it, and that's it. I would imagine I can see that coming in any kind of a form, but the impact that it could have there on, say, a female athlete coming up to performance there could swing things in quite a wide different direction for anyone. But yeah, so that I think that's a huge point to kind of just pay attention to, that your own individual experience as an athlete is something that if you are involved in coaching, that it's something you do maybe take a little bit of experience from, but you can often largely shelve it as well.
This question's a little bit out of left field. I'm going to aim it at Emma Ross. When looking previously at animal studies, were there differences in male-female responses to anything there that you're aware of even?
Oh God, you're going to ask me to answer questions on animal studies.
No, I don't know. I'm not certain of like how much you've read on that, or Emma Cowley, if you know what there either.
I feel like Em's probably been immersed in this literature. I'm not going to put you on the spot, Em. I probably have some thoughts, but what do you think?
I haven't got a notion. I don't work in the lab, so I wouldn't have a clue. And also they were all like excluded from this analysis. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer this one.
I think the only insight that we probably both have, because we are, we do deal with humans, and that's where our head's at. But that we do know that, depressingly again, the cells that are used in bench research. So you've got a petri dish and you're looking at whatever you're looking at when you're a scientist who works with cells and rather than whole people. There was, up until very recently, we're talking in like the last 10 years. There was no mandate that those cells had to be anything but male, and they were largely male. I can't remember the statistics now, but largely and that's really important, because drug discovery and all of the stuff that we do in humans comes from an original study that was done in a petri dish, and unfortunately those cells had the DNA of males. So it was only recently flagged and then addressed that, oh, okay, if you're going to be doing this research, because there's no excuse about volunteer bias when you're using cells, is there? You can get female cells. I mean, I don't know how you get your cells if you're a bench researcher, but so there was a stipulation put that you needed to represent both male and females equally in your cell study. So that's important. Again, some of this stuff, it seems obvious when you say it out loud, but for generations, decades and decades, we've just been accepting the status quo. And I think it's really important when we think about innovating in this space, because coaches are some of the most innovative people I know, in terms of they play around with science, because they have that privilege. I think it's amazing to play almost without doing any harm, but they get to take all of this stuff that's being churned out of sports science and go, what if I did this, and I know that this person responds in this way. So we have that privilege as coaches, yet all the information that we're being given to play with isn't really representative for women. So we need to throw that in there now.
Is that privilege sometimes combined with a pressure to get, just say for example, this training stimulus over a 6-week period leads to a 4% increase, but because there's a pressure on you as a coach to deliver for your athlete, well, I need to see now how can that become a 6% increase by individualising it for the athlete in front of me. And if they're female and we say the mile per marathon just by having a sports brand, is that what I suppose in a way forces coaches to look that bit deeper at, okay, what else is going to give us more benefit here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I came from a system that was famous for marginal gains, and I would walk around going, if you're ignoring the menstrual cycle, that's not a marginal gain, that's huge. And I think the pressure is on coaches, and that's why the status quo is the easiest place to exist. So even though I think coaches are innovative, I know that at the top level it's really scary to try something different when something has worked with another athlete, because you go, well, if that worked, I'm going to keep doing that because I know it works. And if I change it, someone's going to say, why the hell did you change that when you got a gold medal or a championship or a World Cup with that? So it's a scary place to be when you say, I'm going to do something different. And we do have to acknowledge that a little bit here, particularly, I said before that when we speak to coaches about some of the female specific factors associated with training and performance, it's a scary place to go because it's the least, it's the place the least as a coach, but yet your sport so well, training so well. And it's scary, and we really accept that. And you have to be a little bit vulnerable to go to a scary space and say, especially as a man talking about female stuff, to say, okay, I'm gonna step into this space. I'm gonna get it wrong. I might say the wrong words. I might offend someone and not mean it. But actually, my intention is I want to understand the human body better and train this female athlete better. I asked you who was listening to your podcast, guys, and you said there's some teachers here, there's some coaches, and teachers, you understanding why twice as many girls are dropping out of sport as boys throughout puberty is really important, because for health and for performance, the base of pyramids is getting smaller for girls quicker than it is for boys, and the health of girls is compromised by the fact they don't do physical activity. And if you aren't willing to step into that space to understand what's happening to a girl's body during puberty and really go there, like I talk to teachers all the time, and I'm like, how many girls give you a note when they're on their period for PE or for swimming? And they're like, yeah, loads. And I was like, what do you do with it? They're like, well, what can I do with it? I can't say anything. And I'm like, well, you could. I'm like, you can't say you need to do PE, but you could say, what's troubling you? Have you had any help getting, overcoming that? Did you know that doing some gentle exercise might help your period pain? Can we try something? Have you had? And they're like, oh God, I wouldn't want to do that. And I'm like, well, that's the kind of courage we have to have in this space if we're gonna shift the needle on any of this, on the research that reviewed, on the participation dropout rate. We've got to be a bit braver.
Yes, just something, Emma, that struck me there was that you've mentioned in the journals that you've reviewed in your paper that there was a huge disparity in the amount of papers, including for psychology, which I would imagine is, obviously it's an up and coming area, but that understanding of both, say, teachers, coaches and stuff, the psychology there in working in female sport, as well as the psychology of the actual athletes or female participants as well. Do you think they're big areas of research that should be kind of, start to open up a lot more? Or, do you kind of feel like it's not really a huge area to look into?
Yeah, so I think that was one of our kind of limitations within the journals that we selected, because none of them were specifically looking at sport and exercise psychology. And I know, like, from my own research, now in saying that my research only includes teenage girls, and so I think it would be interesting to actually do some focus groups with teenage boys. But from research that's already, or the literature that's already available out there, I mean, there is a difference, and I'm speaking specifically around engagement with exercise and physical activity at adolescent level. And girls across the board talk about how they, psychology wise, they feel as though they're being judged. They feel like there's not enough opportunities available for them to get involved. They feel like people are looking at what they're wearing, their bodies, that they're not good enough, so on and so forth. And they're afraid of competing and kind of even almost risking getting involved in certain sports because they're afraid that people are going to ridicule them or make fun of them. Whereas when there's focus groups with boys, or they're just speaking with boys of the same age group, they talk about excluding girls because they feel like girls aren't strong enough or that they can't play sport, and so it's just easier to not include them on teams. And so I think actually having more research looking at the reasons why people do engage or not engage with sports is really important. And I also think if I think specifically to this paper, I think we need more information from the public, whether that's through kind of process evaluations or from whatever, about recruitment. So we know that there are more men who volunteer to take part in sports science research, and obviously that's nothing that we can do as academics or as researchers. We can't drag women into the lab and force them to take part in these things. So but actually understanding why women aren't volunteering, is it because of lack of time? Is it because they don't want scars from muscle biopsies? Is it because the recruitment poster didn't have the right language or only had pictures of males? Like, are we putting these posters in the wrong places? Like, all of these things that we just aren't going to know how to resolve until we actually talk to people. I feel like I've gone totally off your question in terms of psychology. But yes, I do think that we need more information as well, though, in terms of the reasons why, I guess, people, that their experiences of physical activity and exercise, and we'll know that through more psychology based studies.
But I think that's what you said, is so important for all research, because I mean, you touched on it there in terms of recruitment, but the behaviour of women and how that has developed because of not nature, not our biology, but nurture, like the world we grow up in and how women are seen in that world. That's so important. Like, even if you're thinking about nutrition and you're saying, oh, recovery needs, you need to get this many grams of carbohydrate and protein, and saying that to a guy and saying that to a girl there is a completely different language, because girls have much more emotional relationships with food. They obviously have much more emotional relationships with body image. And so moving the needle on actually that intervention being taken up by girls is really different from guys. And so even we look at it sometimes through a physiology lens and say, oh, what are the hormones doing and what? But actually, the layer on top of this is really understanding females and women and how they might think and behave. That could be a factor in your research, whether you're doing, a peak power test on a cycle ergometer, through to a nutritional intervention, through to a psychological intervention, through to a participation in school PE, like Em looks at. There's a whole layer of psychosocial factors, which if you're ignoring, even as a physiology researcher, again, but because we've always researched guys and men and the male, we haven't really been taught how to think about that. That's not a skill that as a researcher or as someone who's interpreting research we've been taught. So we need to factor that in, because all of this is about behaviour, isn't it? Ultimately, whatever we find out in science is about changing behaviour. Whether you're a coach, whether you're a teacher, whether you're trying to engage more teenage girls in physical activity, it's about behaviour. And until we incorporate our understanding of how women might behave differently from men and why that is into some of this stuff, it's going to be translated much more slowly and be impactful much less of the time.
I think as well, when I just think of you saying there in terms of behaviour, and I think if you almost rewind into the people who are designing these studies, so, it is almost easier. I mean, it is easier to study males only. Like, it's usually cheaper, it's usually shorter. If you think about looking at different training protocols, okay, you have 4 training protocols, you get a guy in once a week for 4 weeks, you're done and dusted, where that could actually take over a year, in women, or, or not over a year, but you know what I mean? Like, it can take much longer, and as Emma said earlier on, it's not like all women have the same cycle length, so there's so much more variability. And I think it's important that we do acknowledge that it's not just as easy as including more women. And also, I'm thinking in terms of PhD or postdoc, you're obviously under time pressure to get these studies done, these publications out, because that's, it ultimately affects your career. And so I absolutely appreciate that to just include men. In a lot of ways, it's just easier. But I don't think that's an excuse to exclude women. And so that's why I think that things need to change at lots of different levels. So whether that is having funding calls specifically to include women, whether that's changing the expectation of what's in a PhD. So, I don't know, if I think of myself, like usually in LJMU, it's 3 studies. Well, if you're including women, maybe you can't include 3 studies, and that doesn't mean that your PhD is any less worthwhile. It just means that your study is different. And I think that, there's a much bigger change that's needed. And when I was thinking there in terms of like our behaviours and our biases, I don't know. I'm not saying that this is the reason for this gender data gap. but are more women or are more men academics studying men? Is there are more women academics studying women? What about reviewers? We know that the majority of manuscript reviewers are men. If it's not double-blinded, we also know that more female papers are getting rejected. They're not getting into these high-impact journals. So, and again, I'm not saying that is the reason, but it has to be a contributing factor to this. And so I think that changes are really needed at every level. And yeah, that it's not just as simple as just, it's obviously about changing how we recruit to actually get more female volunteers in, but also the funding, the time restrictions, and those people in various academic positions supporting the inclusion of women.
I was going to say, it feels hard now. And it feels like Em said, there's no doubt that it's more complicated, more costly, you have to put more thought into it. But only because we've only ever done it the other way. Like, change is always tricky. And changing how we do things is always going to feel like, oh, it's a massive effort. But that's only a reflection because we've just taken the sort of the route of least resistance so far, which is not how science should work, right?
I think I don't know if Kelly's listening to this, she might kill me, but I think if Kelly was here, I think a lot of people are afraid to include women because it seems really sophisticated and, you need all these different measures. But I don't think it has to be that way. And I think, Kelly might advocate for that any type of inclusion and any resources that you have that allows the inclusion of women is great. We all have gold standard measures of everything. So just because you can't do 1 million blood markers and whatever else doesn't mean that you just can't include women. It's just about doing what you can do. But I do think that probably having, a fear of not having these sophisticated measures might lead to the exclusion of women.
I think it's very multifactorial. There's an awful lot of things that impact on this overall, but there's an awful lot of things that this can further impact on. And even just to build on a few of your points there, Emma, that you said the traditional way is 3 studies for your PhD, and you just want to get those done with, to an extent, as little hassle as possible. I know a researcher at the University of Oslo, he hosts the Everything Hurts podcast. I listen to it quite a bit, Dan Quintana, and he suggests, now this is largely from a psychological background, that he feels there should be more replication studies included as part of a PhD. This is just to try and replicate some of various psychological studies that were done that are like, oh, we're not actually 100% certain that that's true. But I think to tie that in, if you're investigating caffeine, creatine, whatever it is, replicate a previous study done on creatine that was just done in all males. And as one of your studies, you just replicate that in all females and, where possible, control for the various factors that are female specific. And then go on and do study 2, study 3, and if they're male-female mixed, all female because you found something interesting, or you're just focusing on a particular dosage of caffeine, response time, whatever, let it be that. Also, I think that there is the whole publication bias around significant versus null findings, that if you do something in females only and you find no significant differences compared to males, well, there's just less chance of getting that published in general. So while some of the studies may actually be done because they're finding null findings, we don't know because they don't make it to publication. And that's where, again, preprints and stuff like that can be more useful. I just want to slightly build on that with just, even in terms of being mindful of when working with females on practical stuff, like you mentioned bra size and everything there, but say I look at athletics and you think of the 400 metre hurdles, the female hurdles are lower than the male hurdles. But look at a soccer pitch, a GA pitch for the majority of our listeners in Ireland, like the goalpost is at the same height. And so much criticism tends to be of goalkeepers in female sports, massively improved over the last 10 years. I will also say, like, the if you want to see improvements in sport, it's in goalkeeping in an awful lot of female sports. It's phenomenal. What's the average height difference between males and females? Like on average maybe 4 inches. Like, to be fair to female sport, should the goalpost just be dropped 4 inches to make it even? But no, like, so few people would actually consider that. If you were to want to see goalkeeping standards in male sports decrease, raised the crossbar by 4 inches, that would be so much more difficult. Yet that makes it so much harder for females, like as a spectacle of sport, to be competitive with males. Not that I don't think they should be competitive anyway. They should still be seen in their own right, but it does still make it harder to be as good a spectacle. Sorry, back to what you were saying there.
I was just gonna. I think absolutely. I think it's not about equality. It is about equity. But I think what you're saying there about in terms of the guy in Oslo, I think that's so interesting, because I think a lot of the times research that is replicated in women is not seen as novel, but it is novel, because and I think especially when you look at some of the research that is funded, and don't get me wrong, I don't mean to be I'm not hating on anybody else's studies, but some of the really nuanced things that are studied and are funded, I'm like, how is this studied but we can't see that there's a difference between men and women? It is novel and it does need to be explored. And you know what, you're right, there may be no differences, if we say in caffeine consumption, but we don't know that. And so I think that's really important. I think that actually could be a really nice rationale of a different way, instead of if you think about a typical PhD where you're designing an intervention and so on. But I think that's good.
I suppose maybe and it's not necessarily to do with your paper, but a little bit with gender stereotypes. I suppose in your work, Emma, or with the over the years with the English Institute of Sport, have you seen a large change? I know this is anecdotal, you may have some data backing it up, but it's more on how women in sport are viewed from a public perspective at a top level. If we take a look, I suppose something that struck me this summer with the Olympics would have been Simone Biles in how she coped through the Olympics, but how she was viewed for putting herself first. I don't necessarily think if that was a male, that's obviously just my opinion, but if that was a male, that it would have been the onslaught or the kind of the way she was spoken about would have happened. But in your experience with work, have you seen positive or neutral, positive change, or have things been kind of neutral in how female athletes at the top end are kind of viewed?
I mean, I think how females are represented in the media is really interesting when it comes to sport. The females are sexualized, the males aren't. I was at a talk last week actually from one of the top women in Irish sports TV, and she was saying that there was a study by the University of Cambridge, and that the most commonly used words to describe women in sport in the media were pregnant, older, participation, and something else. And the most commonly used words to describe men were stronger, dominant, faster, and something else. So, even how women are portrayed in the sports media, and that's how the public consume these sports stars, isn't it? Is, the men are celebrated for being strong and fast, and then the women are celebrated because, they had a baby last Olympic cycle, or don't they look nice in their kit? So I think we need to really examine how women are portrayed in the media in sport to make that a level playing field in terms of being given credibility for their athleticism and their successes. And I think in terms of high performance sport as a whole, one of the most interesting things I found when I was speaking to lots of people about how we support athletes through that pathway to podium system was that when you look at how females and males move through that system, females are far less likely to go on to full-time training programs, even when they've been identified as extremely talented and offered a place in full-time funded programs, because they cannot see a place in sport for women after you've been an athlete, because only 10% of our head coaches are women. At certain times when I was working at the IS, no performance directors were women. I think when I left there was about 2 or 3. We rarely have senior leadership in sport being female. some boards of sports have no women on them. You know, like when you're a woman and you say, right, well, I'm going to be an athlete for the next 8 years, and then what does my longevity look like in the sport I love or in this high performance system? You go, it doesn't exist. Whereas for males, they're like, yep, sign me up. I'll go on full-time training. I'll be an athlete. And then I'll be whatever all these other men are being, presidents and performance directors and head coaches. And so again, that filters down, that what you can see you can be filters down to the pathway of athletes who then don't go on to full-time training because they decide they need to go and get a university degree as well. So they've got security. So you're not training full-time. So you're not accelerating or developing as quickly in your athletic career. So it's fascinating when you look at the knock-on effects of all of these things, because it's not just about having 30% of women on sports boards. It's about women being represented in sport so that girls can see themselves in sport, whether it's as an athlete or whether it's as anything else. So the picture is always slightly bigger than the single statistic.
It's almost as if in science we want to see more specific work done on females, find out the differences there that we need to be mindful of going forward, but more on a director level, coach level, whatever like that. We want to see everyone there as a human for themselves, and not to see them as males or females, or when analysing games, be it on TV, radio, like that, they're there for their own individual points that they can make on the individual merits, but not he's there because he's a male, she's there because he's a female. They are both there because they have opinions that are worthy of us hearing and we can gain insights from.
Yeah, totally. That would be the ideal future, wouldn't it? And I think having a male pundit and a female pundit looking at a sports game and commentating is absolutely brilliant, because we know that not only do those two individuals bring different perspectives, but being a man and a woman will allow them to bring different perspectives onto the game, onto like what they're seeing in players. And that's brilliant. That's a real richness. But at the moment, that's actually not what people are seeing. They're seeing, or why is she commentating on a man's game? Men's sport isn't a place where women should be speaking, yet for however long men have been allowed to comment on women's sport. So we do need to address some of that imbalance so that we paint a much more equitable picture in sport.
I think as well, we do see an increase, even within the Olympics. It was almost, it was the almost 50-50 this year, which has never been the case before. But from my work on Horizon and speaking with adolescents in schools in the UK and Ireland, one of the big things that came out of it was the girls' feelings like they had to choose between either being feminine or being active. There wasn't any wiggle room for those two to cross over. And so although, and I don't mean that to be in a negative, I think we have made great advancements, and even with, women in weightlifting, we know that weightlifting is, sorry, there's a bus or something outside there, I hope you can't hear that, but I think we've made a lot of improvements in getting rid of some of those stereotypes. But when you're talking to 13-year-old girls, they don't see that yet. And a lot of them also spoke, just kind of following on from what Emma, you were saying about even girls who were active and really enjoyed sports. They talked about how, I don't do it anymore because there's no senior team for the girls, or there's no professional whatever as a sport that they play, so they just drop out, even though they're playing up to that point. By the time they turn 15, or they're enjoying it or they're good at it, they just don't see the point in continuing. And I think the fact that they're recognizing it that early on is a real problem. So I think coming from the elite athletes all the way down to just starting off, we need to change things.
Just to start wrapping up there then, Emma Cowley, if you're to lead this paper again in 2027 with Cowley et al. 2027, and look at the changes in the gender data gap between 2020 and 2026, first of all, what changes would you like to see? And second of all, how potentially could, and we've touched on them quite a bit, but to give a brief synopsis, how could we potentially see those changes happen?
I would love to see more transparency in titles and abstracts and justifications for why participants are included. And I think that's easy to do. I don't think that's a big problem. I think that we should be more transparent, and I would like to see more females being involved, but specifically the research that only includes men, there's no rationale for that. Very few of them, I think 6 out of the 1,500 studies that only included men were looking at like semen quality. Like all the rest of them could have involved women. So I think that really needs to change. Whereas like the papers that only included women, a high proportion of them were looking at female specific health issues. So that's what I'd like to change. And how we change that, I think there needs to be change in funding. So grants, I think we need to obviously attract more female participants. And I also think it would be really good to have like sex disaggregated data, so that when we do have results of papers that we can see the changes or the effect of the intervention on specifically men and women, because then we are just building that data on the specific needs of of male and female population.
And Emma Ross, any changes you like to see when you're co-author there in 7 years' time?
Well, all the things Em said, because if that happened, that would be, incredible. And I think for me, it would be making this stuff as translatable as possible for the people who actually need it. I'm assuming, because this is why I did it, when I did sports science, I did it to help, further knowledge for coaches or athletes or patients or trainers or whatever. And now, a year after I've left the EIS, it's the first time I've been in a role where I haven't had access to academic journals as part and parcel of my job. And the amount of information that sits behind paywalls, and the amount of information that I read and I find really hard to interpret, and I would consider myself, well versed in female physiology and also in practice, that I find hard to really extract what are you actually saying. I spend a lot of my time trying to translate research into usable information for people, and it's really hard. And I think that should be an absolute non-negotiable for anyone publishing research, not just to have a lay summary, because I think that's a real cop-out because people just write it in what they think is simple terms. I think it should be, like you asked me, what do I do, right? I think there has to be something tangible with very plain English that is open to everyone, that you could put in Women's Health magazine or Peak Performance. Does that even exist anymore? Like whatever magazines that your teachers and coaches are reading, that was one side of information that they could go, oh, awesome, I'll do that. And I think if we could do that for every research paper, we'd get much quicker and better translation into practice that could have impact, hopefully when there's more research on women, but on everybody.
Or come to a podcast like this to just give more of an overview of it, and we can dig into some more of the anecdotal stuff. Just very last point then, do you want to just give an overview of your own The Well HQ, bit of an advertisement there, work away.
Oh yeah, thank you, John. So yeah, we're The Well HQ. You can find us on our website, thewell-hq.com, or we're all over socials. We actually have a community that you can now join, where we do 4 sessions with us every month, webinars, clinics, Q&As, interviews, where you can learn more about all of the stuff we've talked about today, whether it's bras, pelvic floors, menopause, menstrual cycle, but as a coach, as a teacher, as a practitioner, as well as a woman. And we have courses and we do talks. So if you want to know more, come and visit us or drop us a line.
Lovely. And Emma Kelly, do you want to thank today's sponsors, Mad City Barbell?
I wish I was wearing my t-shirt. Yeah, absolutely. Go check out Mad City Barbell. They're great.
Lovely. Thanks a million for both of you for coming on today, and hopefully you might be the first guest to make a third appearance then as well at some stage in the future.